The morning mist clung to the headstones like the whispered prayers of the dead, and Ezekiel Thorne moved among them with the reverence of a man who understood that sacred ground demanded more than just respect. It demanded devotion. His weathered hands, mapped with the scars of 67 hard years, guided the worn wooden handle of his spade as he cleared the autumn leaves from Margaret Sullivan's grave. The widow had passed 3 weeks prior, and already the earth was trying to reclaim her final resting place with creeping vines and scattered debris. Ezekiel's silver beard caught the first rays of sunlight as he straightened, his pale blue eyes surveying the orderly rows of markers that stretched across the hilltop cemetery overlooking Redemption Creek. Each stone told a story. Each mound of earth held memories that someone, somewhere, still treasured. That was why he rose before dawn every day, why his bent frame climbed this hill when younger men complained about walking to the general store. This was more than work. This was sanctuary. The sound of hoofbeats shattered the morning stillness like a gunshot through cathedral silence. 6 riders crested the hill at a gallop, their horses kicking up clods of sacred earth as they reined in beside the wrought iron cemetery gates. Ezekiel recognized trouble the moment he saw them. Dust-caked trail clothes, weapons worn loose and ready. Eyes that swept the cemetery not with respect, but with the calculating greed of men who saw opportunity where others saw sorrow. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with cruel eyes and a tobacco-stained beard, swung down from his saddle with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted. Jake Maddox had earned his reputation across 3 territories, and the name Vicious Jake preceded him into every town like the stench of death. His gang had been riding hard for 2 days, ever since the bank robbery in Cedar Falls had gone sideways and left them with empty saddlebags and bounty hunters on their trail. Word was that Redemption Creek had buried its gold somewhere during the war, and Maddox figured a cemetery was as good a place as any to hide treasure. Dead men, after all, rarely complained about uninvited guests. "Look here, boys," Maddox called out, his voice carrying across the graveyard like a bark of laughter. "Appears we got ourselves a groundskeeper. Hey there, old-timer. You know where this town keeps its valuables buried." Ezekiel leaned on his spade, studying the 6 men with the patient attention of someone who had learned to read danger in the set of shoulders and the tension in a jaw. These were not men who had come to pay respects or leave flowers. These were predators, and they had mistaken his cemetery for hunting grounds. "This is consecrated ground," Ezekiel said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. "Folks come here for peace, not conversation. I suggest you turn around and ride back the way you came." The words hung in the morning air like a challenge, though Ezekiel had meant them as simple truth. Maddox laughed, a sound like grinding stone, and signaled his men to dismount. They spread out among the headstones with the casual disregard of vandals in a cathedral, their boots trampling the carefully tended flower beds and their spurs raking furrows in the sacred earth. "You suggest, do you?" the outlaw leader sneered, pulling a plug of tobacco from his vest and biting off a chunk. "Well, I suggest you tell us where this town buried its gold, or we start digging up every grave until we find it. Makes no difference to me whether we dig around the bones or through them." As if to emphasize his point, Maddox spat a stream of brown juice directly onto the small marble headstone of young Timothy Fletcher, age 7, taken by consumption the previous winter. The tobacco juice ran down the carved letters like tears, and something cold and final settled behind Ezekiel's pale eyes. "Now that was a mistake, son," the old gravedigger said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But the outlaws were already moving, fanning out through the cemetery with the efficiency of men who had looted enough towns to know how to tear a place apart systematically. 2 of them began kicking over smaller headstones, laughing at the hollow thud of marble striking earth. Another started pulling up the wooden crosses that marked the paupers' graves, snapping them over his knee for kindling. The remaining pair headed for the small stone chapel at the cemetery's heart, where the more expensive monuments and mausoleums housed the town's founding families. "All of you listening from around the world," Ezekiel said, his voice taking on a strange, distant quality as he watched the desecration unfold. "I wonder where you call home. Every culture, every country, has sacred places where the living honor the dead, places that decent folks understand should never be violated. Comment below and tell me where you are watching from. Because what happens next, what these men are about to learn, is a lesson that crosses all borders and speaks to something deeper than law or custom. Maddox had moved to a larger granite monument, running his fingers over the carved name like a man appraising livestock. Sarah Thorne, beloved wife and mother, born 1821, died 1862. The inscription was simple, elegant, and beneath it someone had carved a small rose, delicate as lace worked in stone. "This one looks fancy, boys," the outlaw leader called out. "Bet the grieving husband buried her with all kinds of jewelry. What do you say, bone picker? This your handiwork?" Ezekiel's hands had stopped shaking. The tremor that had plagued him for months, a reminder of age and arthritis, simply vanished as he watched Jake Maddox place his dirty boot on Sarah's headstone and lean against it like a fence post. The old gravedigger's grip on the spade handle shifted, fingers finding the worn groove where decades of use had shaped the wood to fit his palm perfectly. "That would be my wife," Ezekiel said, and his voice carried a new quality now, something that made the horses nervous and caused one of the younger outlaws to glance toward the cemetery gates as if measuring the distance to escape. "Your wife," Maddox repeated, grinning wide enough to show his gold teeth. "Well then, you know exactly what she took to the grave with her. Start talking, old man, or we start digging. And I promise you, we will not be gentle about it." The silence that followed Maddox's threat stretched taut as a hangman's rope, broken only by the restless stamping of horses and the distant call of a mourning dove from the oak tree that shaded the older section of the cemetery. Ezekiel stood motionless among the headstones, his weathered face showing nothing more than the patient resignation of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that some conversations ended only one way. Maddox took the old gravedigger's silence as submission and turned to his men with the satisfied grin of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. "Tear this place apart, boys," he commanded, gesturing toward the stone chapel with its modest bell tower and stained glass windows that caught the morning light like fractured rainbows. "Start with that fancy building. Rich folks always hide their valuables in churches and such. And check every expensive-looking grave marker. Dead rich folks got to take something valuable with them for the afterlife." The outlaws scattered through the cemetery with renewed purpose, their earlier casual vandalism transforming into systematic destruction. Two of them kicked in the chapel doors, the ancient wood splintering with a sound like breaking bones. Through the doorway, Ezekiel could hear them overturning pews and smashing the simple wooden altar where Reverend Morrison had conducted burial services for the better part of 20 years. The other gang members began attacking the larger monuments with crowbars and pickaxes pulled from their saddlebags, tools more commonly used for breaking into bank vaults than for grave digging. Granite chips flew like sparks as they hammered at the carved angels and crosses, reducing hours of skilled stonework to rubble in their search for hidden compartments and buried treasure. But it was when they reached the northeastern corner of the cemetery, where a neat row of simple white crosses marked the graves of Union soldiers who had died far from home, that Ezekiel's demeanor began its subtle but unmistakable shift. These were the graves he tended with special care, the resting places of men who had worn the same blue uniform he had once worn, who had carried rifles like the one he kept hidden beneath the loose floorboards of his caretaker's shed. One of the younger outlaws, a thin man with nervous eyes and hands that shook from too much whiskey, began kicking over the military markers with particular enthusiasm. "Look at this," he called out to his companions. "Soldiers buried with their pay, I bet. Probably got silver dollars in their pockets and gold teeth we can pry out." The man's boot connected with a cross marked Captain James Whitmore, 14th Pennsylvania Infantry, and the wooden marker snapped at its base, falling across the carefully maintained grave mound. Ezekiel's pale blue eyes followed the trajectory of the falling cross, and something cold and distant flickered in their depths, like winter lightning behind storm clouds. "That man saved my life at Antietam," Ezekiel said quietly, his voice carrying across the cemetery despite its softness. "Cut 3 Confederate boys off my back when I was reloading. Figure he deserves better than having his grave kicked apart by a drunk." The nervous outlaw paused in his destruction, something in the old gravedigger's tone penetrating even his whiskey-fogged awareness. But Maddox barked out a laugh that shattered the moment of hesitation like a stone through glass. "Listen to the old fool, trying to scare us with war stories," the gang leader sneered. "What are you going to do about it, Grandpa? Challenge us to a duel with your shovel." As if summoned by Maddox's mockery, another outlaw emerged from Ezekiel's tool shed carrying the Gravedigger's implements. A pick, 2 spades, a measuring rod, and a long-handled post-hole digger, all worn smooth by decades of use. The man hefted the tools with exaggerated admiration, testing their weight and balance. "Look here, boys," he announced. "These are some fine toys our bone picker has got himself. Real professional equipment. Tell you what, old man, since you are so good with digging tools, you can help us dig up these fancy graves. Start with that big marble one there. The one belongs to your dear departed wife." The outlaw pointed towards Sarah's monument with the tip of Ezekiel's own spade, and the gesture carried an obscene casualness that made the morning air seem suddenly colder. Maddox nodded his approval and pulled a flask from his coat, taking a long swallow before wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Smart thinking," he agreed. "The old buzzard knows this ground better than anybody. Probably knows which graves are worth the effort and which ones just got bones and rotted wood. Get to digging, Gravedigger, and maybe we will let you keep breathing when we are done here." They forced Ezekiel to take the spade, surrounding him in a loose circle that allowed no possibility of escape while keeping their guns within easy reach. The old man accepted the tool with hands that no longer trembled, his fingers wrapping around the familiar handle like a musician picking up his instrument. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, feeling the weight and balance of the spade, his mind calculating distances and angles with the automatic precision of long experience. Then he drove the blade into the earth beside Sarah's grave and began to dig. The work went slowly, not because Ezekiel lacked the strength or skill, but because each shovelful of displaced earth felt like a violation of everything he had spent the last 8 years protecting. Sarah's grave had been his responsibility, his sacred trust, and now he was being forced to participate in its desecration by men who understood nothing of love or loss or the promises that bound a man to the dead. As he worked, the outlaws continued their systematic destruction of the cemetery, overturning headstones and smashing monuments with increasing enthusiasm. They had found nothing of value yet, but their blood was up now, the thrill of vandalism feeding on itself like a fire consuming dry timber. Even the nervous one had overcome his momentary hesitation and was attacking the military crosses with renewed vigor, snapping them like kindling and scattering the pieces across the sacred ground. It was when Maddox grew impatient with the pace of the digging and kicked at Sarah's headstone that Ezekiel stopped working. The gang leader's boot struck the carved rose at the monument's base, chipping off a petal and leaving a brown smear of dried mud across Sarah's name. The impact made a sound like breaking glass, sharp and final, and Ezekiel straightened slowly, the spade hanging loose in his grip. "That is my wife's grave," he said, and his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, carrying the kind of quiet that came before thunderstorms and avalanches. Maddox laughed again, but this time the sound held a forced quality, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as his men. "I heard you the first time, old man, and I told you to keep digging. Matter of fact, I think we will crack open that fancy coffin and see what kind of jewelry your beloved took with her. Wedding rings, maybe some pearls, possibly even gold teeth worth pulling." The gang leader gestured toward 2 of his men, and they moved forward with crowbars and hammers, ready to complete the violation that Ezekiel had been forced to begin. But as they approached the partially excavated grave, something in the air changed, as subtle as a shift in the wind, but as unmistakable as the scent of rain before a storm. Ezekiel stood up fully for the first time since the outlaws had arrived, and years seemed to fall away from his stooped frame like a discarded coat. His shoulders squared, his spine straightened, and his pale blue eyes went as cold and empty as winter sky. The hands that had shaken with age now held the spade with rock-steady certainty, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the flat, emotionless tone of a man who had killed before and would kill again. "I am asking you one last time to leave this place." The moment stretched between them like a blade balanced on its edge, and in that silence came the sound of approaching hoofbeats from the valley below. A single rider was climbing the winding path to the cemetery, moving fast enough to raise dust, but not so fast as to suggest panic. Maddox glanced toward the sound with the automatic wariness of a man who had spent years watching for pursuit, but his attention quickly returned to the old gravedigger who stood among the desecrated headstones like a statue carved from winter stone. Sheriff Tommy Morrison rode through the cemetery gates at a controlled gallop, his young face tight with the kind of determination that came from duty rather than experience. At 26, he had been wearing the badge for only 8 months, appointed after the previous sheriff had been killed in a saloon shooting that most folks agreed could have been avoided with better judgment and faster reflexes. Tommy had neither the gray hair nor the scars that marked a veteran lawman, but he possessed something almost as valuable in a man charged with keeping the peace: the ability to recognize when a situation had moved beyond his understanding. He reined in his horse beside the broken chapel doors and took in the scene with the quick, systematic glance of someone who had learned to read trouble in the details. 6 armed men, expensive horses, quality weapons worn for use rather than show. Destroyed headstones, scattered flowers, violated graves. And in the center of it all, an old man holding a spade with the stillness of someone who had reached the end of whatever patience he possessed. "You men are trespassing on consecrated ground," Tommy announced, his voice carrying the formal authority of his office despite the slight tremor that betrayed his nerves. "I am going to have to ask you to mount up and ride out of Redemption Creek immediately." Maddox turned toward the young sheriff with the lazy amusement of a cat watching a mouse walk into its cage. "Well now, boys, looks like the local law has arrived to save the day. Tell me, Sheriff, you planning to arrest all 6 of us by yourself, or are you just here to watch us work?" The gang leader's hand rested casually on his gun, but not quite a threat, but certainly a promise, and his men shifted position to present multiple angles of fire. Tommy was outnumbered, outgunned, and everyone present knew it. But instead of reaching for his weapon or attempting to assert his authority through bluster, the young sheriff found his attention drawn to something that made his blood run cold with recognition. Ezekiel Thorne had not moved during the exchange between Tommy and Maddox, but his stillness itself had become a kind of presence, like the moment before lightning strikes when the air grows heavy and charged. His pale blue eyes held a distant quality, as if he were looking through the present moment into some older, bloodier time. Most unsettling of all was the way his hands gripped the spade, not like an old man leaning on a tool for support, but like a weapon master testing the balance of an unfamiliar blade. Tommy's gaze moved from Ezekiel's hands to his face, noting details that he had somehow missed during his previous visits to the cemetery. The old gravedigger's features held a weathered hardness that spoke of violence and survival rather than simple age. Faded scars marked his knuckles and the left side of his jaw, white lines that could only have come from knife fights and close-quarters gunplay. Most telling of all was the way Ezekiel carried himself now that his stooped, elderly posture had fallen away like a discarded disguise. Sheriff Morrison's father had been a cavalry officer during the war, and had filled his son's childhood with stories of legendary fighters and famous gunmen who had carved their names into history with lead and steel. One name in particular had been spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints and prophets, a man who had earned a reputation that transcended the normal boundaries between law and legend. "Dear God," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible above the morning breeze. "You are Ezekiel Thorne. You are the graveyard marshal." The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water, and even Maddox's confident grin faltered as he registered the sudden change in the young sheriff's demeanor. Tommy's face had gone pale, and his right hand moved unconsciously toward his weapon, not in threat, but in the instinctive gesture of a man who suddenly realized he was standing in the presence of living legend. Ezekiel acknowledged the recognition with a slight nod, his pale eyes never leaving Maddox's face. The nickname had been earned during his years as a federal marshal, tracking killers and outlaws across territories where law was often nothing more than the speed of a man's draw and the accuracy of his aim. But it was not his skill with a gun that had earned him the title, though that skill was considerable. It was his habit of ensuring that every man he killed received a proper burial, complete with wooden marker and recorded name. For 12 years, Ezekiel had ridden the circuit courts and territorial boundaries, bringing justice to places where justice was often nothing more than a rumor. Cattle thieves, claim jumpers, murderers, and road agents had all fallen to his guns, and every single one had been buried with dignity and respect. Not because they deserved it, but because Ezekiel believed that proper treatment of the dead was what separated civilization from savagery. He had carried a small leather-bound book in his saddlebags, carefully recording the name, date, and location of every man he had killed in the line of duty. Beside each entry, he noted where the body was buried and what words, if any, had been spoken over the grave. It was this meticulous attention to the final dignity of even his enemies that had earned him the respect of lawmen and outlaws alike, and the nickname that followed him from town to town like a benediction. "That is just old wives' tales and campfire stories," Maddox said, but his voice carried a forced quality that had not been present before. The confidence was still there, but it was now seasoned with the first taste of genuine uncertainty. "There ain't no graveyard marshal. Just stories told to scare children and greenhorn deputies." Tommy dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, as if any sudden gesture might trigger something terrible and irreversible. He had heard the stories all his life, passed down from father to son like family treasures. The federal marshal who never missed a shot, who tracked killers across thousand-mile distances, who gave every dead man a proper burial regardless of the crimes they had committed in life. The stories were true, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "My father served with Colonel Patterson's cavalry unit during the territorial campaign. He was there when Marshal Thorne tracked the Crimson Creek gang through 300 miles of desert and brought them all in. Dead, every one of them, but buried proper with markers and everything." Ezekiel shifted his grip on the spade handle, and the movement was so subtle that only Tommy caught its significance. The old gravedigger's stance had changed again, settling into the balanced position of a man preparing for violence. His pale eyes swept over Maddox and his gang with the professional assessment of someone calculating angles, distances, and probabilities of survival. 47 men are buried in this cemetery," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying the flat, emotionless tone that Tommy's father had described as the most frightening sound he had ever heard from a human throat. "I put every one of them here personally, dug their graves, built their coffins, carved their markers. Some died for crimes against innocent folks. Some died for crimes against the law. Some died for being in the wrong place at the wrong time." He paused, his gaze moving to a section of older graves beneath the spreading oak tree, where 3 weathered wooden crosses stood in a neat row apart from the other markers. The wood was gray with age, and the carved names had been worn nearly smooth by years of weather, but they were still readable to someone who knew what to look for. 3 of them, he continued, pointing toward the oak tree with the tip of his spade, made the mistake of mocking my profession. Called me a bone picker and a corpse robber, just like you boys have been doing. They are buried over there, next to each other, so they can keep on talking for all eternity. Jeremiah Black, Carlisle twins from up Montana way. They thought it was funny too. Maddox glanced toward the 3 graves beneath the oak tree, and for the first time since arriving at the cemetery, his expression showed something approaching genuine concern. The markers were old, certainly, but they were also identical in style and spacing, suggesting that they had been erected by the same hand at the same time. More disturbing still was the precision with which they had been placed, aligned perfectly with the points of the compass like the work of someone who took burial seriously indeed. "You are trying to scare us with ghost stories, old man." But Maddox's protest lacked conviction, and his men were beginning to shift nervously, hands moving closer to their weapons not in preparation for attack, but in the unconscious gesture of men who suddenly felt the need for reassurance. Tommy stepped forward, his young face grave with the weight of knowledge passed down from father to son. "It ain't ghost stories," he said quietly. "It is history. And you men just made the worst mistake of your lives." The recognition in Sheriff Tommy's voice hung in the morning air like the tolling of a funeral bell, and Jake Maddox felt something cold settle in his stomach as he watched the old gravedigger's transformation complete itself. Ezekiel Thorne no longer looked like a harmless cemetery caretaker. He looked like exactly what he was. A man who had spent 12 years of his life hunting killers across territories where survival depended on being faster, smarter, and more ruthless than the men who lived outside the law. Enough of this nonsense, Maddox snarled, his voice cracking slightly as he fought to maintain control over a situation that was slipping away from him like water through broken fingers. I do not care if he is the graveyard marshal or the angel Gabriel himself. He is one old man against 6 of us. Kill him now, and let us be done with this foolishness. The gang leader's hand dropped toward his gun, and his men followed suit with the automatic coordination of men who had practiced violence together until it became as natural as breathing. But even as their fingers found the grips of their weapons, something in Ezekiel's stillness warned them that they were no longer dealing with an ordinary confrontation. This was not going to be the simple execution of a helpless old man. This was going to be something else entirely. Ezekiel's right hand moved with a speed that defied both his apparent age and the laws of human motion, flowing toward the concealed holster beneath his worn coat with the fluid precision of a striking snake. The Colt Peacemaker appeared in his grip as if summoned by will alone, the barrel already leveled and steady before Maddox's own weapon had cleared leather. Time seemed to compress and stretch simultaneously, each heartbeat lasting an eternity while the entire sequence unfolded in the space between one breath and the next. The first shot echoed across the cemetery like thunder in a cathedral, and Carlisle Jenkins, the nervous outlaw with shaking hands and whiskey breath, dropped to his knees among the scattered military crosses with a look of profound surprise on his face. A neat hole had appeared in the center of his forehead, perfectly round and immediately fatal, and he toppled forward across Captain Whitmore's broken grave marker as if paying final respects to the soldier he had desecrated. The second shot followed so closely behind the first that they seemed like echoes of each other, and Pete Morrison, no relation to the young sheriff despite sharing his surname, spun sideways into Sarah's granite monument with his gun still half drawn and his eyes already glazing over. The bullet had taken him through the heart with surgical precision, and his blood painted a bright streak across his wife's carved name before he slumped to the ground in a position that almost suggested he was kneeling in prayer. The remaining 4 outlaws scattered among the headstones with the panicked efficiency of men who had suddenly realized they were not predators but prey. 2 of them dove behind the larger monuments, using granite angels and marble crosses as cover while they tried to bring their own weapons to bear. The third scrambled toward his horse, apparently deciding that discretion was indeed the better part of valor. The fourth, Maddox's Lieutenant Danny Reeves, pressed himself flat against the chapel wall and began working his way toward the corner where he could get a clear shot at the old marshal's back. "This is my territory," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying clearly across the cemetery despite its conversational tone. "I have walked every inch of this ground for 8 years. I know every sight line, every angle of cover, every place a man might think to hide. You boys chose the wrong battlefield when you decided to make your stand in my graveyard." To prove his point, he moved through the cemetery with the fluid grace of a man who knew exactly where each headstone stood and which paths offered the clearest fields of fire. His intimate knowledge of the terrain transformed the graveyard from a random collection of obstacles into a carefully designed killing ground where every monument and marker had been positioned with tactical advantage in mind. The outlaw who had sought cover behind the Kowalski family mausoleum discovered too late that his hiding place offered protection from only one direction. Ezekiel appeared at the structure's side entrance, moving with the silent precision of a ghost, and put a bullet through the man's temple before he even realized his position had been compromised. The shot was fired from less than 6 feet away, close enough that powder burns scorched the dead man's hair, and he collapsed beside the ornate iron gate with his unfired weapon still clutched in his hand. Meanwhile, the outlaw who had tried to reach his horse learned that Ezekiel's reputation for accuracy was not limited to close-quarters combat. The man had almost reached his mount when the marshal's 4th shot took him between the shoulder blades from a distance of nearly 100 yards. The bullet punched through his spine and dropped him face first into the dirt of the cemetery road, his horse shying away from the sudden violence and galloping down the hill toward town with empty stirrups and trailing reins. Danny Reeves pressed himself tighter against the chapel wall, his breathing harsh and panicked as he listened to the methodical elimination of his companions. For shots, for dead men, and the old marshal had not even moved from his original position near Sarah's grave. Reeves had fought in saloon brawls and ambush shootings, had killed 3 men himself in various disputes over cards and women, but he had never faced anything like this systematic, professional destruction of his gang. The lieutenant tried to edge closer to the chapel's corner, hoping to get an angle on Ezekiel's position, but his boots scraped against a loose stone, and the sound carried clearly in the unnatural silence that had fallen over the cemetery. Instantly, he heard the distinctive click of a revolver's hammer being drawn back to full cock, and he froze against the wall like a man who had suddenly found himself balanced on the edge of a cliff. That would be Danny Reeves, if I recall correctly. Ezekiel's voice came from somewhere behind him, though the lieutenant was certain he had been watching the old marshal's position near the grave. Your reputation preceded you into Redemption Creek by about a week. 3 killings in poker games, 2 stage robberies, and that business with the preacher's daughter up in Silverton. Quite a resume for a man not yet 30. Reeves spun around, his gun coming up fast, but found himself staring into the barrel of the marshal's peacemaker from a distance of perhaps 10 feet. Ezekiel had somehow circled around the chapel without making a sound, using his knowledge of the cemetery's layout to approach from an unexpected direction. The old marshal's pale eyes held no emotion whatsoever, no anger or hatred, or even professional satisfaction. They were simply empty, like looking into winter sky. "How did you get behind me?" Reeves whispered, his voice cracking with the strain of holding his weapon steady while staring death in the face. "Same way I got behind the Crimson Creek gang, and the Baxter brothers, and all the rest," Ezekiel replied with matter-of-fact calm. "I learned the ground before the fight started. You boys made the mistake of thinking this was just a cemetery. For me, it has been home for 8 years." The 5th shot was almost anticlimactic, a sharp crack that echoed off the chapel walls and sent a flock of sparrows bursting from the bell tower in panicked flight. Danny Reeves crumpled to the ground with his unfired weapon still gripped in his hand, his expression frozen in the moment of realization that he had been outmatched by a man who turned killing into a precise, professional art. Jake Maddox found himself alone among the headstones, surrounded by the bodies of men who had followed him into what they thought would be an easy score. The cemetery had become a charnel house, decorated with corpses and painted with blood, yet Ezekiel Thorne stood among the carnage as calm and composed as a minister delivering a Sunday sermon. The old marshal had not even worked up a sweat during the brief, violent engagement that had reduced his gang from 6 men to 1. Tommy Morrison remained frozen beside his horse, his hand resting on his gun, but making no move to draw the weapon. The young sheriff understood that he was witnessing something that transcended ordinary law enforcement. This was not an arrest or even a gunfight in any conventional sense. This was justice being delivered by a man who had been appointed by federal authority to bring order to lawless places, and who possessed both the skill and the legal right to carry out that appointment with lethal force. "Fortinine Graves," Ezekiel said quietly, his voice carrying across the cemetery with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "That puts me just 1 short of an even 50. I always did prefer round numbers. They look better in the record books." Maddox backed away slowly, his eyes darting desperately around the cemetery as he searched for some avenue of escape or tactical advantage that might save his life. But everywhere he looked, he saw only headstones and monuments, markers for men and women who had found their final rest in this peaceful place that he had chosen to violate. The irony was not lost on him that he was about to join them, another name to be carved on a wooden cross and recorded in whatever book the graveyard marshal kept to track his deadly work. "You cannot just murder me in cold blood," the gang leader protested, his voice rising with desperation as he continued his slow retreat toward the cemetery gates. "I surrender. I am your prisoner. You have to take me in alive and let a judge decide my fate." Ezekiel considered this argument for a moment, his pale eyes studying Maddox with the dispassionate attention of a doctor examining a diseased organ. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the certainty of a man who had been given the power to make life and death decisions and had never abused that trust. "You desecrated consecrated ground," he said simply. "You violated the graves of soldiers who died for their country. You forced me to participate in the desecration of my wife's final resting place. Most importantly, you drew weapons on a federal marshal in the execution of his duties. That makes this a legal killing under territorial law, and I always finish what I start. Jake Maddox continued his slow retreat through the cemetery, stepping carefully around headstones and grave markers, as if the dead themselves might reach up from their final rest to drag him down into the earth. His eyes never left Ezekiel's face, searching desperately for some sign of mercy or hesitation that might offer hope of survival. But the old marshal's pale blue gaze held no more emotion than winter ice, and his gun remained steady and ready in his weathered hand. "Wait," Maddox said, his voice cracking as he held up his free hand in a gesture of surrender while keeping the other wrapped around his gun butt. "Wait just a minute now. I got money, plenty of money. Gold coins and silver dollars from a dozen bank jobs. It is yours, all of it, if you just let me ride out of here. I will disappear, go to California or Mexico, somewhere you will never see me again." Ezekiel listened to this desperate offer with the patience of a man who had heard similar pleas from countless outlaws facing their final moments. In his 12 years as a federal marshal, he had learned to recognize the difference between genuine repentance and the frantic bargaining of men who would return to their criminal ways the moment they escaped justice. Jake Maddox belonged firmly in the latter category, and they both knew it. "Money will not restore the headstones you destroyed," the marshal replied quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. "It will not repair the chapel or replace the flowers you trampled. Most importantly, it will not undo the desecration of my wife's grave. Some offenses cannot be purchased away with stolen gold." As if to emphasize his point, Ezekiel glanced towards Sarah's granite monument, where the partially excavated grave mound bore silent testimony to the violation that had triggered his deadly transformation. The sight of that disturbed earth, sacred ground torn open by greed and malice, brought a flicker of something hot and dangerous into his pale eyes before the professional calm reasserted itself. "Your wife." Maddox seized on this apparent weakness like a drowning man grasping for driftwood. "She would not want this, would she? A good woman, a church-going woman. She would not want you to become a killer for her sake. Think about what she would say if she could see you now, about to murder a man in cold blood right beside her grave." The words hung in the morning air like a challenge, and for a moment something shifted in Ezekiel's expression, a brief glimpse of the pain that had driven him to abandon his career as a federal marshal and take up residence in a cemetery where he could tend the dead with the devotion he had failed to show the living. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of sorrow that made even Jake Maddox stop his desperate retreat and listen. "Sarah died of fever in the winter of 1862, while I was tracking the Hendricks gang through Colorado territory," Ezekiel said, his gun never wavering despite the emotion that colored his words. 3 weeks she fought that sickness. 3 weeks she called for me while I was chasing killers through snowdrifts and mountain passes. The doctor said if I had been there, if I had gotten her to Denver where they had proper medicine, she might have lived." The old marshal's eyes took on a distant quality, as if he were seeing not the cemetery around them, but some other place and time where choices had been made and prices paid. His voice continued with the mechanical precision of a man recounting a story that had haunted his dreams for 8 years. "I found the Hendricks gang eventually, all 5 of them, and I killed everyone in a fair fight outside a trading post near Leadville. But when I got back to Redemption Creek, Sarah had been buried for 2 weeks. The townspeople had done their best, given her a proper funeral and everything, but I was not here. I was not here when she needed me most, and I was not here to say goodbye." Maddox sensed opportunity in this revelation, mistaking grief for weakness, and pressed his advantage with the desperate cunning of a man fighting for his life. "Then you know what it means to lose someone," he said urgently. "You know what it feels like to have regrets, to wish you could change the past. Well, I got family too, a sister and her children back in Kansas. If you kill me here, they will never know what happened to me. They will spend the rest of their lives wondering and waiting for me to come home." Ezekiel considered this appeal to shared humanity for a long moment, his gaze moving from Maddox's face to the damaged graves surrounding them and back again. When he finally responded, his voice held the terrible certainty of a man who had found his purpose in the depths of loss and would not be swayed from it. "I became a gravedigger to stay close to Sarah," he said simply. Every grave I have dug since then has been an act of penance, every burial a prayer for forgiveness. This cemetery is not just my job, it is my confession, my attempt to make amends for choosing duty over devotion. And every man buried here, every marker I have carved, and every flower I have planted is part of that sacred work. The marshal's gun rose slightly, the barrel centering on Maddox's chest with the precision of a compass needle finding true north. His next words carried the weight of divine judgment, spoken with the authority of a man who had appointed himself guardian of the boundary between the living and the dead. You violated that sacred work, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You turned this place of peace and remembrance into a battlefield. You desecrated the graves of soldiers and civilians alike. Most unforgivably, you forced me to participate in the violation of my wife's final resting place. That is not something that can be forgiven or forgotten. Maddox's desperate retreat had brought him to the edge of the cemetery, where the wrought iron gates stood open like an invitation to freedom. Behind him lay the road to town and the possibility of escape, if only he could outdraw a man whose reputation had been built on the bodies of faster men than himself. His hand tightened on his gun, but as he calculated distances and angles, trying to determine whether he could clear leather and fire before the old marshal put a bullet through his heart. But Ezekiel seemed to read his thoughts with the uncanny accuracy of a man who had faced this same desperate calculation from dozens of cornered outlaws. With deliberate slowness, he holstered his Colt Peacemaker and stepped back 3 paces, his hands falling to his sides in the classic position of a man preparing for a formal duel. I am going to give you something I never gave the others, the marshal said, his voice carrying across the cemetery with ceremonial formality. A fair chance. Draw when you are ready, and may God have mercy on your soul, because I will not. The morning sun climbed higher above the eastern hills, casting long shadows between the headstones and monuments that bore witness to this final confrontation. A meadowlark called from the oak tree that shaded the soldiers' graves, its song sweet and pure in the sudden silence that fell over the cemetery like a benediction. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as 2 men faced each other among the markers of the dead, their hands poised above their weapons in the eternal dance of the gunfighter's trade. Maddox's nerve broke first, and his hand swept downward toward his gun with the frantic speed of a man who knew his life depended on the outcome of the next few seconds. But for all his desperation, for all his years of violence and killing, he was still only human, still subject to the limitations of flesh and bone and mortal reflexes. Ezekiel Thorne was something else entirely. His draw was not fast in any conventional sense, but rather efficient, economical, perfect. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish, just the smooth, practiced flow of a man who had reduced violence to its essential elements and mastered every one of them. His Colt appeared in his hand as if it had always been there, the hammer already cocked and the barrel aligned with surgical precision. The 2 shots came so close together that they sounded like a single report echoing off the chapel walls, but only one of them found its target. Maddox's bullet went wide, striking a marble angel and chipping away a wing in a shower of stone fragments. Ezekiel's shot was centered perfectly, taking the outlaw through the heart and dropping him to his knees among the scattered flowers of Sarah's grave. For a moment, Jake Maddox knelt there in the morning sunlight, his eyes wide with surprise and his mouth working soundlessly as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. Then the light faded from his gaze, and he toppled forward, falling across the partially excavated mound of Sarah's grave in a position that almost suggested he was begging forgiveness from the woman he had helped to violate. Ezekiel stood over the dead outlaw's body for a long moment, his smoking gun still gripped in his steady hand, before finally holstering the weapon and kneeling beside Sarah's damaged monument. With infinite care, he began straightening the carved rose that Maddox's boot had chipped, his weathered fingers tracing the delicate petals as if he could repair the damage through touch alone. "I am sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice so quiet that even Tommy Morrison, standing just 20 feet away, could barely hear the words. "I am sorry they brought their violence to your resting place. I am sorry I had to kill them here, in this sacred ground. But I could not let them go unpunished. Not after what they did." The old marshal's hands were shaking again, the tremor of age returning now that the deadly calm of combat had passed. But his touch remained gentle as he cleared away the scattered earth and began the process of restoring his wife's grave to its proper condition. There would be time later to dig fresh graves for the 6 dead outlaws, time to carve their markers and record their names in his careful ledger. For now, there was only the need to heal what had been damaged and restore what had been violated. Sheriff Tommy Morrison approached slowly, his young face grave with the weight of what he had witnessed. The bodies of 6 men lay scattered among the headstones and monuments, testament to the lethal efficiency of a legend come to life. But the most profound sight was the old gravedigger kneeling beside his wife's grave, his deadly hands now employed in the gentle work of restoration and care. "Marshal Thorne," Tommy said quietly, unsure of the proper protocol for addressing a man who had just demonstrated why his reputation had survived 8 years of retirement. Ezekiel looked up from his work, and his pale blue eyes held the exhausted satisfaction of a man who had settled an old debt and found peace in the settling. When he spoke, his voice carried the simple dignity of someone who had never doubted the righteousness of his actions. "Just Ezekiel now, son," he said, returning his attention to Sarah's damaged headstone. "The marshal died the same day she did. What you see here is just an old gravedigger who takes his work seriously." The sun climbed toward its noon position as Sheriff Tommy Morrison helped Ezekiel restore the damaged headstones and scattered flowers that marked the aftermath of the morning's violence. Working in companionable silence, the young lawman and the old gravedigger moved through the cemetery with the careful attention of men who understood that sacred ground demanded more than just cleanup. It required restoration of dignity, renewal of respect, and healing of the spiritual wounds that violence left in its wake. Tommy had sent word to town about the incident, and by mid-morning a delegation from Redemption Creek had arrived at the cemetery gates. Mayor Harrison Blackwood led the procession, followed by Reverend Morrison, Dr. Pemberton, and a dozen other prominent citizens who had come to witness the scene of the legendary gunfight and pay their respects to the man who had defended their cemetery with such deadly efficiency. The townspeople moved through the graveyard with the hushed reverence of pilgrims visiting a shrine, their eyes taking in the scattered bodies of the outlaws and the methodical way Ezekiel continued his restoration work despite their presence. Most of them had known him only as the quiet, elderly man who tended their cemetery with obsessive care. None of them had suspected that beneath his humble exterior lay the skills and reputation of one of the most feared lawmen in territorial history. Mayor Blackwood approached Ezekiel with the careful deference of a man who had suddenly realized he was dealing with living legend. "Marshal Thorne," he said formally, his voice carrying across the cemetery with official authority, "on behalf of the citizens of Redemption Creek, I want to express our profound gratitude for your protection of this sacred ground and our deepest apologies that you were forced to resort to violence in its defense." Ezekiel looked up from his work straightening the military crosses, his pale blue eyes studying the assembled townspeople with the patient attention of someone who had learned to read the hearts of men in their faces. When he spoke, his voice carried the simple dignity of a man who had never sought recognition for doing what he considered his duty. "No thanks necessary, Mayor," he replied quietly. "This is my home now, and a man protects his home when it comes under attack. These boys made their choice when they decided to desecrate consecrated ground. I just helped them understand the consequences of that choice." Reverend Morrison stepped forward, his weathered hands clasped before him in the gesture of a man comfortable with speaking of divine justice and earthly judgment. "The good book says there is a time for peace and a time for war," he said solemnly, his voice carrying the weight of theological authority. "What happened here this morning was the Lord's justice delivered through human hands. Evil came to this holy place, and evil was turned away by a righteous man with the skill to defend what needed defending." The Reverend's words carried the approval of the church and the sanction of divine authority, transforming what might have been seen as a brutal gunfight into something approaching sacred duty. The assembled townspeople nodded their agreement, their faces reflecting relief that their cemetery had found such a capable guardian and gratitude that they need never fear for its safety again. Dr. Pemberton, a practical man with little patience for theological discussions, approached the bodies of the dead outlaws with professional interest. 6 men, he observed after a brief examination, all killed by single shots placed with surgical precision. I have seen the aftermath of many gunfights, Marshal, but nothing quite this efficient. Your reputation for accuracy was not exaggerated. Ezekiel accepted this professional assessment with a slight nod, then returned his attention to the work of restoration. The townspeople watched in fascination as he moved through the cemetery with intimate knowledge of every stone and marker, correcting damage and replacing disturbed earth with the meticulous care of an artist restoring a masterpiece. The town council convened an impromptu meeting right there among the headstones, and after brief deliberation, Mayor Blackwood made an official proposal. Marshal Thorne, he announced, we would like to offer you the position of official cemetery caretaker, with a salary commensurate with your skills and a house on the grounds if you desire it. This position would carry the authority to enforce the peace and sanctity of this sacred place by whatever means you deem necessary. Ezekiel considered this offer while continuing his work, his weathered hands gentle as he replaced the flowers that had been scattered by the morning's violence. When he finally responded, his voice held the quiet certainty of a man who had found his true calling in the most unlikely of places. I appreciate the offer, but I cannot accept payment for this work, he said simply. What I do here is not a job. It is service, penance, and privilege all wrapped together. I will continue to care for this cemetery as long as I draw breath, but not for money. Some things are too sacred for commerce. The townspeople exchanged glances of amazement and respect. In a world where every service carried a price and every skill demanded payment, they had discovered a man who considered his work too important for monetary compensation. It was a revelation that elevated Ezekiel's status from mere employee to something approaching guardian angel of their sacred ground. As the morning progressed, more citizens arrived from town to witness the scene and pay their respects to the man who had defended their cemetery with such deadly effectiveness. Among them came Martha Whitmore, the elderly widow of Captain James Whitmore, whose grave marker had been among those damaged by the outlaws. She approached Ezekiel with tears in her eyes and gratitude written across her weathered features. "Thank you for defending my husband's grave," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "James served his country with honor, and it means everything to me that his final resting place has such a devoted guardian." Ezekiel paused in his work to take the old woman's hands in his own, his pale eyes soft with understanding and compassion. "Your husband saved my life at Antietam, Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently. "If not for his courage, I would not be here today to tend his grave. Defending his final rest is the least I can do to repay that debt." The exchange between the old soldier's widow and the man who had been saved by her husband's sacrifice added another layer of meaning to the morning's events. The townspeople began to understand that Ezekiel's protection of their cemetery was not just about law enforcement or personal pride. It was about honor, duty, and the sacred bonds that connected the living to the dead across the spans of years and memory. Throughout the day, Ezekiel worked with methodical precision to dig 6 new graves in the section of the cemetery reserved for those who had died by violence. Each grave was dug to the same exacting standards he applied to all his work, perfectly aligned and measured with military precision. The outlaws who had come to desecrate sacred ground would themselves be given proper burial, because even in death Ezekiel maintained the standards of dignity and respect that had earned him his legendary reputation. As he worked, the old gravedigger reflected on the story that had unfolded among these headstones and monuments. "For those of you who have followed this tale to its end," he said quietly, addressing not the townspeople around him, but some larger audience beyond the boundaries of the cemetery, "I wonder what it has meant to you. Have you ever had something sacred in your life, something so precious that you would fight to defend it? Comment below and share your thoughts, because stories like this one remind us that some things are worth defending, no matter the cost." The sun began its descent toward the western hills as Ezekiel completed the burial of the 6 outlaws, each grave marked with a simple wooden cross bearing the dead man's name and the date of his death. Jake Maddox's marker bore an additional inscription, carved with deliberate precision, "Desecrator of Sacred Ground." The words served as both epitaph and warning, a message to any future outlaws who might consider violating the peaceful sanctity of Redemption Creek Cemetery. Sheriff Tommy Morrison approached as Ezekiel finished his work, his young face serious with the weight of official responsibility. "Marshal, there will be an inquest," he said formally. "The territorial judge will want testimony about the shooting, witness statements, evidence of justification." Ezekiel straightened slowly, his weathered hands brushing soil from his clothes as he considered the bureaucratic requirements that would follow the morning's violence. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm certainty of a man who had never doubted the righteousness of his actions. "I will provide whatever testimony is required," he replied simply. "The law will find that 6 armed men violated federal statutes regarding the desecration of military graves, threatened a federal marshal in the execution of his duties, and drew weapons with intent to commit murder. The shooting was justified under territorial law and military regulations." Tommy nodded, recognizing the precision with which Ezekiel had structured his defense of the cemetery to fall within the boundaries of legal authority. The old marshal had not merely been defending his personal property. He had been enforcing federal law regarding the protection of military burial grounds, and his status as a retired federal marshal gave him the legal authority to use deadly force in that enforcement. Years passed, and the story of the graveyard marshal's return to action became legend throughout the territories. Travelers would make detours to visit Redemption Creek Cemetery, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had single-handedly eliminated 6 armed outlaws in defense of sacred ground. But they found only a quiet, elderly gravedigger who tended his markers with obsessive care and spoke little of the violence that had briefly shattered the peace of his sanctuary. The cemetery itself became known as the safest, most peaceful place within 500 miles. No outlaw, no matter how desperate or bold, ever again attempted to violate the sanctity of Redemption Creek's burial ground. Word spread along the outlaw trails and in the saloons of frontier towns that the cemetery was protected by something more dangerous than law or tradition. It was guarded by a man who had made defending the dead his sacred calling, and who possessed both the skill and the legal authority to enforce that calling with lethal precision. Ezekiel aged gracefully among the headstones and monuments he tended, his silver hair growing white and his step becoming slower, but never less sure. The tremor in his hands returned with the years, but it never affected his accuracy when target practice called for it. The townspeople learned to trust in his guardianship completely, secure in the knowledge that their loved ones rested under the protection of a man who would literally die before allowing their peace to be disturbed. On quiet mornings when the mist clung to the headstones like the breath of spirits, Ezekiel could be found beside Sarah's grave, speaking softly to the carved rose that marked her final resting place. He would tell her about the flowers he had planted, the new graves he had dug, the families who had found comfort in his careful tending of their loved ones' memorials. Sometimes he would mention the outlaws who had tried to violate her grave, and how he had dealt with them. But mostly he spoke of peaceful things, of sunrise and birdsong, and the eternal quiet that he had learned to value above all earthly treasures. The graveyard marshal's final legacy was not the men he had killed or the reputation he had earned, but the sanctuary he had created and maintained through decades of devoted service. Redemption Creek Cemetery became a place where grief could heal and memory could flourish, where the living could visit the dead without fear, and where the sacred boundary between life and death was honored and protected by a man who understood that some duties transcend law, tradition, and even life itself. When Ezekiel Thorne finally laid down his spade for the last time, the townspeople buried him beside Sarah with a ceremony that drew mourners from across 3 territories. His simple headstone bore the inscription he had requested: Ezekiel Thorne, guardian of sacred ground, husband of Sarah, servant of the dead. And beneath those words, carved with the same precision he had brought to all his work, was the number 50, marking the final tally of a man who had lived by the gun, but found his redemption in the gentle work of tending graves and honoring memory.